I want to welcome in Kristen Wagner. She's with the ADL, the Alliance for Defending Liberty. I believe I have that attribution correct. Kristen, we had you yesterday as well on the show, coming out of the Supreme Court. After the arguments over with the justices, the oral arguments for whether or not states like West Virginia and Idaho can ban men from participating in women's sports, trans sports issues, you came in. It's ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, not Liberty. Tomato, tomato. But it is ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. But I also found it fascinating. I don't know how long you stuck around, Kristen, but I guess the tariff arguments were a few weeks ago, but we're expecting a decision to come down at some point on the tariffs as well. But let's just talk about the trans thing. It's, Secretary Bessent said he thinks that hearing oral arguments at the Supreme Court is one of the last things that were as the framers intended it, to really hear these people. And he accepted Ketanji Brown Jackson. He said, but for the most recent justice. It's really fascinating to hear the process. He kind of dismissed her because she's really bad. Even if you're on the left, you have to acknowledge she's just really bad. But it must have been fascinating to hear those arguments, which did boil down to, like, hey, what is a woman?
Well, it was fascinating. At ADF, we've had the privilege to have 20 cases before the Supreme Court in just the last decade or so, and I've argued 3 of those cases. So it's been a privilege to look at all the different arguments and see how justices show up. In this particular instance, we at ADF represented 3 of the female athletes that were parties to the case. We were also co-counsel and stood alongside Idaho and West Virginia. So it was a big day for us, and it took us about 10 years to get there. In terms of when we first started seeing girls being challenged in locker rooms and on the athletic field. And I sure hope it doesn't take another 10 years in order to ensure that all girls have the right to equal opportunity and fairness.
So, Kristen, I'm going to characterize this. You tell me if I get it wrong, okay? And you heard me say, sort of, you can go all the way to the Supreme Court, and it's going to boil down to that now infamous question, what is a woman? And here's why. Tell me if I characterize this correctly, okay? The Constitution of the United States does not preclude the state from discrimination. We all walk around kind of regurgitating that cliche, like you can't discriminate. No, you can discriminate, and we do it all the time. Laws discriminate. They even discriminate on the basis of race. But for every category of discrimination, and the Supreme Court has their categories of discrimination, there's a different test. So, for example, if the state is discriminating on the basis of race, either overtly or subversively, they have to satisfy a very heavy burden. That burden is called, in legal terms, strict scrutiny. Why are you discriminating on the basis of race? Do you have a very, very valid reason to be doing so? And the answer in some occasions is yes, right? But there are other categories like sex, and that's what we call intermediate scrutiny. So the state still has a burden, but it's not as heavy as it is with race to show why you have an interest in discriminating. So the question for the court in a lot of ways was whether or not these trans athlete bans are sex discrimination and what standard did they use to uphold or strike down the law. And it boiled down to Justice Alito going, hey, can you define sex? He didn't do what is a woman, but he did, can you define sex? And the answer was no from opposing counsel. And he's like, well, how can I decide if it's sex discrimination if I can't define sex? And it therefore came down to that same old question, what is a woman?
It absolutely does. And actually, this is one area where I sort of agree with Ketanji Brown Jackson. If you remember in her confirmation hearing, she says she needs to ask a biologist. I don't need to ask a biologist, but I do know it's rooted in biology. We know for a fact that men have physical advantages over women, and there's no testosterone suppressant or puberty blocker that erases those advantages. And I think it's important to point out the ACLU absolutely does know what a woman is. They are intentionally trying to blur the line and erase the line. And what I didn't hear enough of yesterday, I didn't hear enough about the voices of the women that have been harmed by men coming into their sports. First of all, between the 2 categories, boys and males are treated the same across the board. So really what the ACO was trying to do is change sex into gender identity and to give special treatment to those men who would identify as women and not equal treatment. And that's the real heart of the issue. But man, I want to hear more about the 423 girls that the male athlete in West Virginia displaced 1,100 times. And I want to hear from the girls that lost 57 medals, Or how about our clients who literally were bumped from advanced competition because the male athlete took the client, took her role, took her roster spot? Or the other clients that we had that actually had to compete against a guy at the NCAA championship, and in the NCAA championship took the Big Sky championship. And obviously they didn't even make it into the championship as a result.
What does that mean, displaced? It's a stunning stat. One athlete displaced 400 some odd female athletes. What does displaced mean?
Well, in track in particular, where we're seeing this, you get to higher competition and you make your way. There's only a limited number of people that can fill those lanes, right? Whether it's the top 8 lanes that get to take the track in terms of the heats. And then it's only a certain limited number that can then compete for the advanced competition. So one male athlete has a seismic impact on all of the other girls that are trying to compete in track. And that's what we've seen. I mean, even in Connecticut, we had a case that has continued there where 2 boys competed as boys, 3 weeks later competed as girls, took 15 state championships in just a couple year period. I mean, this is what's happening on the ground. So to not have that come out loud and clear and have just everyone focusing on the boy who wants to compete as a girl rather than the unfairness. And the fact that, the boy's in the girls' locker room and he's actually sexually harassing the girls. They've said that under oath. We need to talk about that too. Our rights shouldn't be erased.
Justice Amy Coney Barrett pressed counsel on, and I don't know that I fully understand the argument, so I'd love for you to help me out here, that how is it sex discrimination if it only runs one way? So both, I believe, Idaho and West Virginia banned males from competing in women's sports. So to use the parlance of our times, trans girls. Keep trans girls out of girls' sports, so boys competing in girls' sports. But it didn't work in reverse. Do I have that right, Kristen? So if a girl wanted to go compete in boys' sports as a trans man, the states didn't preclude that. And how does that cut? Tell me the logic, which is law, of Coney Barrett seeing that as an important point.
Well, I think you have to understand the 2 legal arguments, which you clearly do. But for your audience, in terms of what was being argued, there's an equal protection claim under the Constitution, and then there's a statutory claim called Title IX under federal law. And the equal protection claim basically says you have to treat similarly situated people similarly. And you already talked about the level of scrutiny that you get to in that. And in that particular application, what the court is looking at are there reasonable differences between men and women that would cause you to treat them differently? And, you like to see on different chyons and the media talking about, well, this is a transgender ban. Well, actually, females who identify as males they can compete in the male category because they're never going to be as strong. They're never going to be as competitive. They don't have those physical advantages. And so it's not actually, it's recognizing those differences. On Title IX, though, I think it's important to point out the Title IX statute itself actually says you can make these differences on the athletic field, in living facilities, and even in sex ed classes, because we all know that those differences are important in those settings.
Okay, so a trans ban at large, what I hear you saying, would probably satisfy Title IX. But on the equal protection front, you don't want to argue, or it's not even tailored, the law, to be a trans ban. And part of the points of that is if it's just a ban on boys joining girls' sports, it's easier to satisfy the reasonable standard for the level of scrutiny required. Do I have that right? So that
I would phrase it a little different.
Okay.
Sorry. I would phrase it a little different because it's actually no men get to do this, right? So the distinction is the male category applies to the boy no matter how he identifies. And really what's going on here is trying to replace the word sex for gender identity. Those who are identifying as the opposite sex have every right to compete in sport. But what matters in sport isn't your gender identity. What matters is your sex. And for that reason, it doesn't violate the Constitution, and certainly not Title IX, which it's written into the law that you should make those distinctions. Does that make sense in terms of what I'm thinking?
I follow.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems Title IX is the easier standard to satisfy. I think it satisfies the 14th Amendment as well, the Equal Protection Clause, because I think it's totally absurd, all of this, ultimately, in the end. Like, I'm indulging the legal arguments, so I think they're interesting, and I think that hearing the justices sound them out is interesting. But let's never lose sight of the fact that this is commonsensically absurd. And it seems like the Supreme Court actually agrees, right? Like, coming out of that, it's always hard to predict off of oral arguments, but it does seem like the Supreme Court would uphold the Idaho and West Virginia laws banning boys from participating in girls' sports.
I'm extremely hopeful, and 27 states actually have these laws. So we want those laws to be upheld in all of those states. And if we don't, what we'll see is that girls are going to become spectators in their own sports. And again, I would just emphasize what we didn't hear yesterday was enough focus on the girls in these cases, but also even on the language, using terms like cisgender or transgender. Let's talk about biological reality. Men who are identifying as girls, but they are men. Language matters, and it especially matters in the courtroom.
I totally, that's right. The point of a courtroom, which I appreciate, is the precision of language. Even you, like I pushed you, what do you mean by displaced? All of these words have meaning. A lot of people don't want those meanings questioned because they're actually trying to lead the audience in a direction that it doesn't obviously mean. And so I think it's really interesting because I love how humans communicate and the stuff that's going on underneath the surface of our communication. Great job yesterday. Great job today. I almost made you a member of the ADL, Anti-Defamation League. I'm glad to correct the record that you were a member of the Alliance for Defending Freedom. Kristen Wagner, thanks for being with us here today.
Oh, thanks for covering it. I appreciate it.